The media narrative is a calculated misdirection. It fixates on the kinetic, the launch flash, the high-altitude intercept. This is a deliberate distraction from the real vector of attack, designed to channel analysis towards conventional, high-cost scenarios. A regime facing a systemic solvency crisis, as documented by Al Jazeera and Juris.org, does not engage in a symmetric, high-cost exchange. The internal pressure from deadly protests requires an external, asymmetric solution with maximum leverage. The primary target is not a carrier group. It is the global data vascular system. CSIS models confirm that a coordinated severing of key undersea fiber optic cables results in a systemic liquidity seizure. It is not a crater. It is a global economic blackout. The second vector is orbital, satellite blinding. A non-kinetic attack using ground-based lasers to permanently disable critical intelligence and communication nodes. This cripples GPS, global banking, and military command and control without triggering a launch-on-warning protocol. This two-pronged strategy creates the blind Leviathan. The United States becomes a military and economic superpower with its eyes gouged out. Its fiscal insolvency, a coming reckoning according to the Times of Israel, makes a sustained conventional response a mathematical impossibility. The silence is the weapon. The motive for escalation is never strength, it is weakness. A regime facing terminal collapse operates under a different set of mathematical principles. For Iran, a failing economy is the direct accelerant for deadly domestic protests. UN officials warn of lethal force against its own population. This is not a political crisis, it is a solvency crisis. The state cannot meet its domestic liabilities, and the social contract is void. This playbook was stress-tested in Ukraine. According to CSIS analysis, the kinetic cost of the initial invasion created a systemic liability for Russia. A prolonged conventional war became a vector for its own internal solvency crisis, transforming the conflict into a deeply unpopular domestic burden. This forced a pivot. Moscow shifted from high-cost ground assaults to lower-cost, asymmetric attacks on infrastructure, a strategic concession driven by economic reality. Tehran observes this model. They analyze their own internal decay against the primary antagonist's fiscal paralysis. A coming reckoning for the United States' national debt is not a fringe prediction, it is a documented reality. This creates a critical vulnerability. The mathematical certainty is that Washington cannot finance a sustained, multi-trillion-dollar conventional campaign in the Middle East. This removes the primary deterrent. A conventional army is a perpetual financial drain. A deliverable nuclear device is a one-time capital expenditure for infinite strategic leverage. For a regime whose alternative is being overthrown, the risk calculation inverts. The cost of not escalating becomes greater than the perceived cost of retaliation. The travel warnings from the US and Britain are not a guess, they are an admission. The pivot to asymmetry is a function of weakness, and the endgame is non-negotiable. The strategic calculus has inverted. It is no longer a function of who can build the most expensive asset, but who can destroy it for the lowest cost. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, quantifies this new lethality model. A $5 million main battle tank is now a liability, rendered kinetically irrelevant by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced exchange. It is a systemic bleed-out, mathematically engineered to drain a superpower's treasury. Analysts term this the democratization of violence. The technological and fiscal barrier to projecting lethal force has collapsed. A regime facing internal solvency crises, like Iran, confronting deadly protests over its failing economy, no longer needs a multi-trillion-dollar industrial complex to generate strategic effects. It needs consumer electronics and a launch-on-warning protocol. This model allows a state on the brink of collapse to export kinetic instability at a fraction of the cost required by a legacy power to contain it. This economic asymmetry directly targets the primary vulnerability of the United States, its own fiscal insolvency. The coming debt crisis removes the strategic option of a sustained conventional response. Each billion-dollar asset deployed becomes a high-value target for a low-cost threat, creating an unsustainable drain on a treasury already at its breaking point. The travel warnings are not just precautions. They are a tacit admission that the kinetic cost to project power now exceeds the ability to pay for it. The recent travel warnings issued by Britain and the US for 16 countries are not the signal. They are the noise. They are a lagging indicator of a systemic decentralization of threat vectors. CSIS analysis confirms that insolvent regimes facing domestic revolt fueled by economic failure are not consolidating power at home. They are externalizing the liability. They are activating gray zones, nations with high political instability but deep integration into Western financial and logistical networks. These regions function as proxy laboratories, low-cost environments for staging materiel, testing response protocols, and cultivating non-attributable assets. The model is not a frontal assault. It is systemic infection. The mathematical certainty is this: a state actor like Iran, facing a terminal solvency crisis, is incentivized to leverage these zones precisely because the kinetic cost of a sustained, multi-theater response is a strategic impossibility for a United States facing its own debt reckoning. This is not war. It is asymmetric liquidation. The Nuclear Command Protocol, known as Launch on Warning, is not an act of aggression. It is a mathematical calculation of survival. The doctrine dictates that if reliable sensors detect an incoming nuclear strike, a retaliatory launch is executed before the incoming warheads detonate. The decision window is not days or hours, it is minutes. This protocol has a systemic vulnerability: the integrity of the sensor data. A hostile actor, particularly a state facing a domestic solvency crisis, does not need to build an ICBM to trigger a nuclear exchange. It only needs to create the illusion of one. This is the fog of digital war. Targeted cyber attack blinds the early warning system. Radar screens go black, or worse, are flooded with ghost signals. The command authority is now flying blind. Is the data loss a system malfunction, or is it a deliberate, blinding attack? The first move in a decapitation strike. The protocol's logic becomes a trap. To wait for confirmation is to risk the complete destruction of your own command and control and retaliatory capability. To launch is to initiate a global kinetic event based on what could be a digital phantom. According to analysts at CSIS, this is the preeminent vector for asymmetric escalation. The commander is not forced to launch out of panic. They are forced to launch by the cold, irrefutable logic of the protocol itself when faced with terminal uncertainty. A regime's tolerance for external risk is inversely proportional to its internal stability. As documented by Al Jazeera and UN officials, Iran is not merely experiencing protests, it is in a state of systemic solvency crisis. Domestic revolt, fueled by economic failure, creates a mathematical incentive for external escalation. When the cost of inaction, regime collapse, is infinite, the calculus of deterrence inverts. The leadership is no longer incentivized to avoid conflict. It is incentivized to initiate it on its own terms. This vector points directly at its primary antagonist. However, the United States is no longer a credible conventional deterrent. According to analyses of U.S. sovereign debt, the nation faces its own coming reckoning. A sustained kinetic expeditionary campaign is a strategic impossibility due to fiscal liability. The balance sheet cannot support a long war footing. The travel warnings issued by the US and UK for 16 countries are not a public service. They are an admission of this strategic insolvency. They are pricing in an escalation they cannot afford to stop. This creates the optimal conditions for an asymmetric probe. An adversary in a zero-sum survival scenario, facing a fiscally paralyzed opponent, will not launch a declared war. It will execute a calibration shot, a disruptive event engineered for plausible deniability to test the response threshold. The target will not be military, it will be economic. The objective is to measure the kinetic cost the US is willing or able to pay. Expect a coordinated cyber-physical attack on a primary US logistics or data hub within the next 12 months. The event will manifest as a cascading blackout at a Tier 1 container port or a Tier V data center cluster. It will be attributed to non-state actors or a technical failure. The true signal will be the muted, non-kinetic US response, confirming the blueprint for further, higher leverage escalation.